Our next speaker is Dr. Sarah Nguyen, who is a lecturer at in the law faculty in Cambridge. Dr. Nguyen has a very broad publication record, and her research has looked at, among other things, whether the International Criminal Court has had a catalyzing effect on legal systems in Uganda and Sudan. And I suppose today then she draws on a very rich knowledge on justice seeking during periods of multiple cycles of violence, which I think speaks directly to some of the challenges that we've seen and we've spoken about earlier today. So enough from me, over to Sarah.
Thank you. Well, we're at the stage of the conference that everything has already been said, but not yet by everyone. So I thank you for giving me the opportunity. And since we're short of time, I won't elaborate the thank yous, but they are heartfelt. Now, Sudan. From all the countries that we are discussing in this panel, Sudan may actually be the most comparable to Iran in the sense of there's an urge for justice, but there's no transition yet. The question then is, on the other hand, you can say, well, Sudan may also be the one country not to follow, because it's a country characterized by transitions without justice. If you look at Sudan's history, it's transition after transition, but never there was any justice. If you look at the most recent comprehensive peace agreement between North and South Sudan, which ultimately led to the secession of South Sudan, there was a provision on wealth sharing, which was considered in a way enough for reparations. There was nothing about paying for the past. It was wealth sharing of the oil revenues would be enough in terms of economic wealth sharing and reparations, but no individual justice, no accountability. There was one clause that called upon the government to organize a reconciliation process. When I interviewed people, they all referred to it as the amnesty clause. Because initially there was an amnesty clause, but because of the international community's pressure, the amnesty clause had to be taken out. It was not allowed to have an agreement signed by the UN with an amnesty clause. So there was a call upon the government to do reconciliation. No action has been taken whatsoever. Now, if we cannot expect any justice from the government, because the government is still in power, the key question then is how to enhance transitional justice, and I think that's why we've gathered today. Well, the first question is, if we talk about how can one advance, who is one? Who is the one who is advancing transitional justice? Because if one can convince the government, who is still in power, to start transitional justice, it will obviously lead to certain compromises. If you get a situation of self-reform, as we had in Chile, where the government will begin to reform, you usually pay the price of an amnesty. There's no way a government is going to reform if it knows it's going to end up in prison. So the other way is, if it's not the government who's reforming and going into transitional justice, is that the international community pushes for transitional justice. But obviously, if you use transitional justice before there is a transition, the government will see transitional justice not as an instrument of justice, but as a political tool in a war game and aiming for regime change. And this is precisely how the government of Sudan has perceived of the International Criminal Court's intervention. The ICC, as you know, has issued arrest warrants for 3 people on the side of the government and 3 people on the side of the armed movements. The people on the side of the armed movements have voluntarily appeared. One was also immediately acquitted, or because there was not enough evidence. And on the side of the government, nothing has happened. Does that mean that there has been no impact at all of the ICC? I want to focus today on 3, as far as there's time, of course, on 3 impacts, and perhaps we can learn some lessons from this also for Iran. First, even though the ICC arrest warrants have not been executed, there are visible results or impacts in Sudan. The first of all, it has opened a debate on transitional justice. But we have to be very careful in analyzing how this has happened. Initially, the ICC's intervention actually stymied the debate. It became prohibited to talk about international criminal justice. The newspapers could no longer work on it. But then the African Union was forced to deal with something or to come up with an alternative to the ICC after the arrest warrant for President Bashir. Because it disagreed with the arrest warrant, but at the same time it realized we cannot be silent on justice and reconciliation anymore. So it reinvented transitional justice not as the same as international criminal law, but as an alternative to international criminal law. And that is actually something that the government likes, because any alternative to international criminal law is good. So suddenly the debate on transitional justice has opened up in Sudan. And that as such is unique. So if you now look at the recently concluded Doha document for peace in Darfur this summer, it suddenly has a chapter on accountability, reparations, truth-telling, things that are unprecedented in Sudan. At the same time, it's not all positive. The ICC's intervention has also led to an intensification of the conflict. And it's quite logical. As we just said, one side will always see it as regime change against it. The other side in the conflict will always use it as a tool to win the war. So the armed movements have, since the ICC's intervention, refused to talk peace with the government, because one cannot talk peace with war criminals. And this is precisely what happens, is that by criminalizing it, you immediately also depoliticize it, because the other party is no longer acknowledged as a political partner. The problem of this is, for instance, for European countries who are big supporters of the ICC, is that they cannot talk with Bashir anymore. And as a result, they've lost a lot of leverage in Sudan, and they've lost a lot of leverage in important political processes. Now finally, there's a question about whose justice and what does justice mean. I just give you an element of an interview that I did in Darfur a few years ago. There were people demonstrating. They were saying, we want NATO, we want the EU, and we want the ICC. And then I asked them, why do you want the ICC? Well, we want the ICC for justice. What is justice? Justice is the end of the war. And then the Ajawid, who are traditional leaders, will do real justice. What is real justice? Justice is compensation. So the point that I'm trying to make with this is that the ICC is seen also by these people not as an instrument for justice in the sense of rights, but it's an instrument of regime change. And then their own people will do real justice through compensation. This is not to say that nobody there wants to see Bashir accountable. And this is the final point that I want to make. A lot has to do also with prioritization. At this stage in Darfur, probably, most people first and foremost want to see an end of the war. They also want compensation. They want their lives back to normal. And I'm sure that in future years, when all these demands have been satisfied, there will be a stronger call for criminal accountability. Just to go for 1 second out of Sudan and go to the neighboring country of Uganda, a country that Phil knows much more about than I do. But what is remarkable there is that when there were polls done among the northern Ugandans years ago, immediately after the ICC's involvement, everybody was very critical about justice, because justice was a threat to the peace negotiations, and people preferred peace to justice at that time. Now, the Lord's Resistance Army is hardly present in northern Uganda anymore. Many reasons are unrelated to the ICC. And if you ask people now, they're actually much more positive about justice, because justice is no longer a threat to the peace. Now, I think that the questions that we have to think about in the context of Iran is, do you want to use transitional justice as a tool for political change? Or is transitional justice an aim in itself? And if it is an aim in itself, do you want to encourage the current regime to transform itself, to open up? Or is the only way ultimately regime change? The tactics that you adopt as a human rights advocate must be different. If you have the long-term view and say, well, the regime first has to change, then the advice would be, act as a prosecutor. You cannot go into the country now, but collect as much evidence as you can so that your case is ready when the moment is there. When you are more focused upon transformation, then make sure that you sell transitional justice in a way to the regime that it's not as dangerous, that it doesn't seem dangerous, and that transitional justice could actually enhance the regime also in rebuilding its the relationship with its people and with the wider world.
Thank you, Sarah, for a remarkably concise and very insightful contribution to these discussions. I think you've really mapped out some possible ways forward and ways of discussing it from another context. With that in mind, our next speaker is Dr. Olga Martin Ortega, who is a senior research fellow at the Centre on Human Rights in Conflict at the University of East London. Olga has worked, her research areas are in business and human rights, post-conflict reconstruction, and transitional justice. But today, she's going to speak to us specifically around the Spanish pursuit of justice decades after the abuse has occurred. So, to hand over to Olga.
Thank you. Well, thanks so much to the organizers. Just to repeat what everybody else has said, it's an honor for me to be here sharing the experiences with the victims in the struggle for the search of justice. I apologize in advance to the translators for having to follow our very fast speeches. I will try to sum up nearly 40 years of human rights violations and other 30 years of silence in 10 minutes. So I'll try. The Spanish transition has been considered as a model until recently. It has been portrayed as a pacted transition, reformist, non-rupturist, peaceful. However, it is also a model of forgetting, limited rehabilitation of victims, and, in all, impunity. The paradox that Spain actually, as we've heard, has been a forum looked at by victims of all around the world for justice and has not even been able to provide justice for its own victims. Very briefly today, I want to look at the Spanish Civil War, the repression of the Franco regime, the transition, and some of the transitional justice initiatives and where we are now. The Spanish Civil War broke on July 17, 1936, after a military rebellion of the army against the legitimate and democratic government of the Second Republic in Spain. It finished in 1939 with the victory of the rebels, which changed history to become the national band since then, and the instauration of a dictatorial regime led by General Franco, which lasted 40 years. His regime started with the proclamation of Franco as the caudillo of Spain for the grace of God. This is very important because it brings back the role of the Catholic Church in Spain in the repression. The regime only finished in 1975 with the death of the dictator. This is something that keeps them bringing up in the Spanish transition. We had to wait for a dictator to die. And once the dictator died, a pact of silence and forgetfulness became, and it has only been broken in the last years. The Civil War, I won't stop too much about it. There was violations of human rights, of war crimes, and what we can consider today crimes against humanity from both sides of the conflict. But what was, and it has remained in our imaginarium as a symbol of civil war, some horrific events such as the Guernica bombing, in this case the allies of Franco, the German aviation. The difference was that towards the end of the conflict, the Franco troops, now considered the national band, were actually started a systematic repression of the other side. The figures varied, and recently the reputed historian Paul Preston, now at the London School of Economics, who's one of the most reputed voices in the Spanish Civil War, considers that 300,000 men died in the fronts and 200,000 civilians died in the far away from the front.